Hey, greetings and welcome. I'm Steve Clemens, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thanks for joining us today for our forum on America's economic recovery, a topic that's very much on everyone's mind these days. And, a lot of people want to know whether it's real or not. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Wells Fargo, for supporting today's conversations. 20 months into the pandemic that's not over, the nation's economic revival is a study in contrast. Rising consumer prices, product shortages, and labor inconsistencies are rattling this recovery, while at the same time, more than 4 million jobs have been created this year alone. The stock market is setting new records and wages are rising. How are consumers navigating the new normal as we seek a return to economic health? What is the growth forecast for next year? And what does a sustained recovery really mean for big and small businesses? We have an exciting lineup of speakers joining me for these conversations, and we'll get to it in just a moment. But first, some housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag the Hill Econ Recovery. That's a lot. I just go with you do what I told you to. The Hill Econ Recovery. But staff, next time the Hill Econ might be better. We're broadcasting live and we'll be taking your questions throughout the program. And as with any live stream, if you have any trouble with the video, don't throw your TV through the roof or throw the computer through the window. Just push refresh the page and it will all be better. We begin with two powerhouse economists. How do they view the current economic landscape and the potential impact of the infrastructure bill and other legislative action coming down the pike? I'm delighted to be joined by Neela Richardson. Neela, it's great to see you again. Chief economist at ADP, a private payroll firm. Prior to that, she was chief economist at Redfin and has had stints at the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, Freddie Mac, and at Harvard University's Joint Center for Housing Studies. And we also have Janet Curry, the Henry Putnam Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at Princeton University. She's also the co-director of Princeton's Center for Health and Well-Being, and she also co-directs the program on families and children at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Welcome to you both. Neela, great to see you again. I've enjoyed our conversations in the past. Give us a snapshot. I mean, I think that what I just said about this economy being one of a lot of contradictions and contrasts is probably right, when you sort of look at some dimensions. I know you've done some studies. You see some elements coming back to normal, and yet you still see some abiding concerns. So give us a snapshot of how you see the economy going right now.
Well, the economy has always been incredibly uneven. What the pandemic has done is exacerbate the differences. And we see that in a jobs recovery that continues. It continues to speed along, but in an incredibly uneven way. And we also see an economy that has a lot of strength, but some of that strength has been based on an unprecedented amount of federal support. So we're now in this transition period where it looks like the Federal Reserve is going to be backing off some of that support in terms of financial conditions and making it easy and cheap to borrow. And also the government has kind of closed in the purse strings. Even though there's an infrastructure bill, these direct payments to households have ceased, expanded unemployment benefits to workers have ceased. So we still are in the recovery mode with less federal support than before. About 4 million people who were working before the pandemic are not working now. Had there been no pandemic, we would have expected another 2 million in the past 20 months to be added. So we're really 6 million in the hole. And it's a big hole to dig out of. The good news is that if the pandemic stays contained, we can expect some still jobs recovery to go forward, again, with a note to how uneven that progress will still be.
Neela, thank you. Before I jump to Janet, can you help me understand this math? So our unemployment is down to about 4.7%, right? Official. I know that there are other elements in that figure for discouraged workers and folks that are part-time employment, but the big number that people look at is 4.7%. You look at the so-called jobs gap, open jobs in the country, at really all different kinds of levels. It's a huge number. And I've just been asking myself, where could that number go to if we actually had, more holistic, if we had wages rise, if we had people, I just want to know how to square the job gap with this low unemployment figure. Can you help me to understand?
The unemployment rate is actually the least important rate right now. It's the participation rate that's more important. The unemployment rate is not telling you the story of the labor market. It's not telling you that there are still 4 million people sidelined by this thing. It's not telling you that a third of workers have been unemployed for 6 months or more, what we call long-term unemployed. It's not telling you about the bottlenecks to hiring that are pervasive through the system. And it's definitely not telling you about the pandemic-related barriers. And I know that my esteemed panelist, Janet, will talk about this, to working families when it comes to limited childcare and education services. So that rate is not telling you the story. No. What we have to do is really look at holistically what's going on. Yes, there's a lot of openings, job openings right now, and there's a lot of churn in the labor market. And what we're seeing is not only a jobs market recovery, but a structural transformation of the world of work at all. Every time you open a Zoom camera, you are experiencing a workplace transformation. And what that means in terms of an uneven economy, there are workers who are sidelined that are being left behind in that transformation.
Well, I really appreciate that clarification. And Janet, I just love that, get your snapshot on the economy, but also why aren't we taking participation rate or other data points that can be marketed, if you will, and talked about by the media that give a more real picture of the fact that this is not just a rosy situation, as oftentimes gets discussed, even from the Biden White House that's so proud of where the unemployment rate is. Your thoughts?
So I want to pick up on one of Neela's points, which is that this has sort of been a long time coming. So we're focusing on the current recession and what was caused by COVID, but there are underlying factors here which have been going on for a long time. So, one of those is the current recession low wages and what was caused for people at the low end of the education distribution. And we've seen declining labor force participation over quite a long period of time, especially for women. So in the post-war period, we had this huge increase in women in the labor force. It peaked in 1999. So that's a long time ago. That's more than 20 years ago, and it's been going down ever since. So, why aren't women participating in the labor market? Well, it's hard, right? It's hard to have a family and it's hard to have a job, and we don't make it any easier for people. We don't subsidize childcare to the extent that other countries do. And people are always talking about Scandinavia versus the US, but let's look at a country like Chile. Chile spends $7,000 per toddler. We spend $500 per toddler, right? So we're not doing even as good a job as sort of a middle-income country like Chile in terms of supporting childcare. We don't have paid leave, as many people have pointed out. We're the only sort of wealthy industrial country that doesn't have any kind of uniform paid leave. And all these things make it difficult to be in the labor market. And then you add COVID and the schools shutting down. 20% of child care centers have closed. They're not reopening. The child care operators are facing higher wages for people, which were not very high to begin with, like $11 per hour. So, there's some structural factors here which have been operating for a long time, and now we're, really needing to look at them if we want to reverse these trends.
I really appreciate you kind of going to the infrastructure, because one of the things that's been haunting my mind, is I kind of come in this as a lay person and take a kind of quick snapshot look of, when you kind of look at that go-go economy that I sort of felt like we were feeling before COVID hit. And I used to tell people, you had a kind of high trust economy. You had just-in-time money, just-in-time jobs, just-in-time credit, and then there was this seizure. And the global supply chain kind of had a heart attack, and everybody. Right now, it feels like the old Soviet Union, where it takes you 3 weeks to buy a washer and get in. And so it's a very different world. And what you just talked about the childcare infrastructure, and then how so many places have closed down. I mean, I organize a lot of parties to DC, just to be honest. And I have a lot of friends who can't come because there's just no available childcare support or babysitting support or other support that normally was there. And I'm like, what happened from that period before? And I think you just described it quite well. But look, that's talking about people who have jobs and others. I'd like to talk to Neela about the parts of the economy of people whose talent has been left on the table, who've been passed by, who are on the lower end of this, and whether or not, when you go through a pandemic like this and you see so much of it digitally, what are our opportunities to rewire that social contract so we can correct some of our problems from the past?
Beautiful question. I love the question, first of all, because I think that's the right question to be asking at this moment. We've focused so much on recovering these low-skill jobs. If you look at leisure and hospitality, before the pandemic, it was roughly 11% of employees, but it took 40% of the job losses. And then you look within the people who felt the brunt of this pain. It's mostly young people, low-skilled people, and older people. So our most vulnerable in the workforce. But there's a huge opportunity here that I'm afraid that might be missed. And that's the opportunity to reskill and retool for the jobs of tomorrow. That was always going to be needed. It was always necessary. These are not pandemic outbursts. These are the structural implications of a digital transformation. And now that consumers have become much more digitally savvy, and as businesses have transformed their operations, big and small businesses have innovated to stay afloat during this crisis too. It means that we have an ability now to train the workers of tomorrow if we invest in them. I'll also say one more statement for those who are working. Preferences have shifted dramatically. People are much more engaged in hybrid work, remote work. Companies are much more forward-looking in health and safety of their workers, because what we've all learned in this process is that a healthy workforce is necessary for the business community as well. It's not just a byproduct of private life. It's also an important part of public life as well.
Look, Janet and Neela, I want to ask Janet first and then Neela. I am so taken with what you just said about upskilling, reskilling, retraining. And I guess, 20 years ago, I wouldn't have believed in those words, that I would have heard them as, a kind of fig leaf over a trade deal or something, that they used to talk a lot about retraining workers. But essentially, you had generations of people forgotten and left behind, and people were focusing on youth and how do you rewire those folks. But I'm sort of interested in whether or not the opportunities to retrain, upskill, engage in continuous education for incumbent workers is a real thing now that we can be embracing and showing and paying for in some way or subsidizing. Janet, I'd love to get your thoughts on that, because it seems to me that's got to be part of a healthy economy.
Yeah, I think, human capital is the most important part of infrastructure, and we need to invest in that human capital. One way to do that with some flexibility is by looking at community colleges, which already do a good job training people to do very specific things. And I'm thinking especially with respect to IT, there's a lot of certifications that people can get, which will be directly useful to them in the labor market. So expanding that sector of our educational system is one way to assist and pick up workers and help them get the skills that they need to really be successful in today's labor market.
Thank you. Neela, your thoughts on that?
Well, maybe that's the silver lining of labor shortages, that companies are much more incentivized to do this, that governments and local and national governments may be more incentivized to work with companies to really reskill, retrain. And also I'd overlay, part of this discussion was going on before in regards to immigration, and we've seen immigration slow down over the past 20 months. So some of the jobs that were filled by new arrivals, new immigrants, are not being filled now. And so those shortages are persistent. And so rethinking what the skills are needed by this country right now, and how companies and government agencies can partner to make sure that those skills, and academic institutions, community colleges, is a really important discussion to have.
Neil, you also tweeted out something I like, because I feel this, because I needed a plumber this week. And you wrote, says, actually, I think the world needs more plumbers. I agree.
Yeah.
And electricians and all specialty trades. Really, the housing market has been chronically undersupplied for the last decade. A key reason is not enough construction workers. Does some of the legislation that's coming down the pike on the infrastructure bill, the Build Back Better bill, does this begin to alleviate some of these pressures, or is that naive to think that we're going to have a magic wand come in and just create a bunch more workers? I have to tell you that, I think ever since the pandemic, anyone who's been trying to find, some folks to help someone who knows nothing about plumbing or any of that stuff, I've been desperate for folks, and it's been a bleak situation on that front. But do you think that the shifts that are going on now in terms of money going into some of these areas will change the game?
I think it is a long-term game changer. I don't think it's a short-term one. That's the promise of infrastructure, is that it pays off years into the future. And it's a good reminder of where we came from. The economy wasn't going gangbusters before the pandemic. It was a slow growth. It was a decade of tortoise-like growth. And at the end of that decade, we finally saw wages starting to break the ice for low-skilled jobs. So if we could pick up where we left off and then add this opportunity to enhance a skill set for skills that the economy desperately needs right now. And I think an infrastructure bill is great, but it creates a lot of demand for labor that we don't have right now. I think there is, again, a huge opportunity to train a workforce for the skills of today and tomorrow. And hopefully that's one of the outcomes.
Janet, what is your thought on what some of the bills coming down the pike might do to change the economic vector we've been on, and are they substantial enough?
Well, as Neil has said, there is no magic wand, so there's nothing that you're going to do right immediately and immediately have a reaction that's going to make things a lot better. But over the longer term, some of the things that may or may not be coming down the pike in terms of maintaining the child tax credit, maintaining support for childcare and working families, those will allow people to go into the labor force and get the training that they need. I think that it's important to keep in mind that even that if you pass like this huge infrastructure bill right now, it's going to take a long time for all of the effects of that to be felt. So it's hard to judge what the success of something is. By the time the full effects are felt, people will have forgotten about all of the discussion and the promises that were made at the time.
Right, Janet, can you kind of explain? Oh, I'm sorry. Can you please also, Janet, explain to our audience this term that you've used, and I was talking to one of the early conceptualizers of it the other day, the she-cession.
Yeah, it's really interesting that people call it that, because if you compare it, for example, to the last big recession, like in 2006, 2009, the employment to population ratio fell by 6% for men and about 3% for women. So it was like 2/3 men, 1/3 women. This time around, it actually fell by about the same amount for men and women. But so relatively, it was felt more by women. But it's not like men didn't get laid off as well. Lots of men also lost their employment. So it's maybe a little bit of a misnomer to call it a she-cession. It's just that usually it's men that lose more when there's a downturn, and this time women suffered as well, because so many of them are employed in sectors like hospitality, services, which showed big declines.
Neil, another obsession of mine in doing this series, it's been supported by Wells Fargo, has been looking at small business. And sometimes I feel resistant to use the word small business because a lot of small businesses, see themselves as big businesses eventually, or they don't want to. But also small business is a frame that often means, kind of where your loan levels are and things of this very sort of what you qualify for. And we saw a lot of businesses excluded in the early support from the government after COVID. So what I've gotten really interested in are these micro ventures, these small, tiny, 1 or 2 person operations that are booming right now. There's a company called GoDaddy that is the biggest internet registrar in the country, and they funded a study done by Arizona State University and University of Iowa and UCLA Anderson School called Venture Forward. It's online, folks. It's Venture Forward. And you can get in and look at these remarkably interesting startups of micro ventures. The chairman of GoDaddy calls them sometimes side hustles that people have done to supplement. And when you look at the racial composition, the gender dimensions, you see a lot more balance out there than you do in, kind of the upper end of the business community. There's something going on with people willing to take risks. And I'm wondering at a company like ADP or something, and I ask legislators the same question, are those micro businesses which are generating revenue and those areas where there are a lot of them are more resilient against recession than those that are not, are they on anybody's radar screen? Have you had any time? I mean, does that make sense?
They certainly are on ADP's radar screen. We provide payroll services, yes, even to sole proprietorships. We provide all kinds of tax solutions. And so small businesses is ADP's bread and butter. Yes, we work with large firms, but we have a heart also and an arm also in the small business community. And I'll tell you what, it's part of this great transformation of the workforce that we talked about earlier. People have understood, and I think there's been a well-documented trend from the Fed that maybe 1.5 million to 2 million people more retired because of the pandemic. But like all these other trends, they were set in motion well before the pandemic. We knew that there was going to be a wave of boomer retirees. What's different, though, is that people now have this option with all this hybrid technology and virtual technology. We have this option on how to supply our work to the market. Many more options than we did 2 years ago even. And so we've seen a ramp up in the new business formations on an average for most of this year of 400,000 a year versus around 400,000 a month versus 250,000 a month before the pandemic. And people have this flexibility now to go into business for themselves and then offer their professional services to the employers. And I would say that if you're thinking of this as a white collar trend, talk to your plumbers because they are small business owners and have done quite well during this time and will continue given the dynamics of the workforce and the lack of people in skilled trades.
Well, thank you. Janet, I've got a question from the audience, posed to both of you, but you first, from Marjorie Parker, who's president and CEO of Jobs First NYC. And she says, how are young adults 18 to 24 recovering, and what are the challenges ahead for young workers, and how is the virtual economy continuing to grow? Your thoughts?
Yeah, there's a lot of research showing that the job market conditions when you enter the labor force have really long-term effects on people. So, if you come into the labor force during a recession, you don't get a good job, then you have, less of a leg up than if you had started better. And that tends to have effects on your earnings that are very persistent over time. So we should worry about the generation that entered in the face of, all of this disruption. Now, people are very resilient, and you were asking about micro enterprises and the self-employed. But a lot of times that is a side hustle, and people would really rather be doing something else, and they're doing that, to keep the wolf from the door. Today, the Wall Street Journal had an article that showed that about a quarter of people who are self-employed were having trouble making ends meet. So it's certainly not necessarily a great thing to see so many people in those, in those occupations.
That's terrific. And just finally, just to end this out, Neela, I remember the 2008-2009 recession, you began to see people talking about gig work and, gig workers. And there was this sort of romantic charm to it that people had greater flexibility. They could go drive when they wanted and come in. But I interviewed somebody the other day at the Web Summit in Lisbon. And, she made a strong case that what we've seen is the continuing hollowing out of benefits and support for, these workers and what she calls precarious work. But a kind of abroad the board slimming down, if you will, of the various benefits around there that we've kind of found that the Ubers and Lyfts and others have found a way to kind of make prettier than it really is. And I found it to be very compelling, and that was caused by another recession. Are we going to be looking at, as we come out of the COVID recession, or I wouldn't call it the COVID experience, that we're going to be seeing again, an attack on benefits people have, the health care, portability of pensions, et cetera? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think we should make a distinction between gig workers, especially young gig workers and professionals later in their career who are opening up and contributing to the workforce in a different way. I do think that we need to be very concerned across the board, young and middle and everything in between and old, about workplace benefits and health benefits and those infrastructures that allow the workplace to continue on. We saw how important health benefits were throughout this pandemic. And so to see any erosion in those benefits is a little, if you're a company who is desiring of labor, you really want to have access to a healthy workforce. And so I would expect somewhat of the opposite. I would expect that there would be more attention placed on the health of workers in the workplace and the mental health of workers. In terms of gig workers, though, we did a survey earlier in the year at the ADP Research Institute, and we've seen much less appetite for gig work, I think, for the very reasons that you cite. So workers are having a moment post-pandemic with all of these labor shortages and job openings. And I think this is a place where you're going to see worker preferences actually move the needle. And it's been a long time since workers have been able to assert en masse what the conditions that they need to make a workplace better. But that's exactly what we're seeing now.
Well, listen, there's been a great discussion. I could go on all day because I'm sort of I think a nerd desperate to understand these different trends going on. But I want to thank Neela Richardson, Chief Economist of ADP, Janet Curry, Henry Putnam, Professor of Economics and Public Affairs at Princeton University. Come back and talk to me and keep me smart on this stuff. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Joining me now is Congressman Dave Schweikert from Arizona. He's a great friend of the Hill, and I'm so happy to talk to him. He's a member of the Congressional Joint Economic Committee. No surprises here, but he thinks the economic recovery is falling short. I do too. So let's find out where exactly he thinks we ought to be, where we ought to be doing better.
Your previous comment, I've always thought of you as a nerd labor economist. So.
Thank you. Well, Congressman, great to see you today. Look, on this show that we did, I had Larry Summers way back, and Larry was saying, look, infrastructure bill, it creates recurring returns for an economy without recurring effort. They're really incredibly important parts in that. But when you begin changing the other elements of the social dynamic and pouring a lot of money out there, we're going to see, potentially worrisome inflation. And he put that out there on the show. I tweeted it out. We made it a big thing. We were part of the noise around Larry Summers and the administration. But look what happened with the consumer price index. Tell us.
Well, look, and I think you need to take it a little bit even further on some of the policies that are moving right now in Washington. The world, particularly North America, is flush with massive amounts of cash. How do you move that cash into items that create capital investment productivity? Because the other way you're going to strip inflation out of the system is pretty ugly. It's going to be the Federal Reserve once again raising interest rates, slowing down the economy. So the literature makes it pretty clear. There's really only two levers here. One is a big productivity spike that solves the imbalance right now between dollars chasing products or people. And you actually see the social spending bill that's being voted on, maybe even today, that disincentivizes that productivity. It also disincentivizes and in some ways a pretty cruel way, a lot of the working poor to also gain skills and participate in the economy. So my great fear is we're about to finance another leg on this inflationary cycle.
You know, Congressman, 25 years ago when I was doing work with the Joint Economic Committee as a young staffer up there, we used to talk about entitlements. We used to talk about, you know, how do you generate long-term solvency in Social Security, Medicare, make sure these entitlements are in the right place. And Senator Joe Manchin has been saying, hey, before we kind of move on another whole class of entitlements, we need to begin thinking about what we have. How much sympathy is there for that kind of conversation among your colleagues?
Steve, my fear is it's still disharmonious, to tell the truth. But there's something going on. I did a floor presentation about a week or so ago, and it went 50 minutes, and it's had 1,300,000 people look at it, and it was almost solely on what's actually happening on the entitlement curve. So there is a public appetite to hear the data. And look, current CBO numbers, even before this year's spending, in 29 years, we're at $112 trillion of publicly borrowed money, and that's inflation adjusted to today's dollars. $112 trillion. And every dime of that borrowing is Medicare and Social Security. 3/4 of it is Medicare, functionally 1/4 is Social Security, and the rest of the budget's actually in positive balance. So the most disruptive thing you and I and policymakers could do is we're going to have to find a way to disrupt the cost of healthcare. And that's actually where, as you start to think about the future of what we're investing in the economy, messenger RNA, the new wearable data, a souped up type of telehealth, a cure for diabetes is the Holy Grail. Remember, 31% of Medicare spending is just diabetes, and diabetes being 31% of Medicare, and Medicare is the primary driver of U.S. debt.
Yeah, we just did a big forum this week on diabetes and what could be done, and kind of looking at the big footprint and the non-commensurate level of research in that area. It's just fascinating arena. If you could begin looking at major gains there, and I had your colleague Representative Michael Burgess on, and he was saying one of the biggest frustration, and Raul Ruiz on the Democrat side said the same thing, that there are these things that we could begin doing that transform the profile of diabetes and impact, and that would mean massive savings, but that nobody's scoring the savings.
Well, and I need to take you to a much more disruptive look. We have only partially vetted it, but there is a paper out right now, oddly enough, from a prestigious university in Taiwan, saying they believe they've had a stem cell success in type 2. We already know there's been a major success for type 1. Are we ready to, instead of investing in more sugar, diabetic, insulin management type technology, and are we ready to almost do the Operation Warp Speed of curatives? Now you got to do the policy side. Are we willing to change the Farm Bill?
Right.
Are we willing to change what we do in nutrition supplements? Would it be cheaper for society that if you're on food stamps, or as it used to be known as food stamps, twice a week to drop off a package at your door of fresh food?
Right.
And it turns out we've been costing out modeling this, saying change those things in the Farm Bill, change incentives in diet, and then step into the disruption of the technology of what happens if it's going to be expensive, but it's still dramatically less expensive than what diabetes means to the rest of society.
Dave, I know that the district that you represent, the economy there is on fire right now, and it's hot in a lot of ways, as I understand it. And you've got so you're outperforming, much of the rest of the country. But what do you see as the gaps, particularly when you look at small business and the struggles they've been through? There have been some businesses that shut down, other businesses that have met the inflection point and been able to adapt and innovate. but hiring, there's a huge hiring gap in terms of people needed for a lot of these positions. But give us a snapshot of what your district looks like and what your worry points are.
It's a brilliant question. It turns out it may be more complicated than I'm almost willing to admit. We're trying to also first get our heads around how many small, almost micro businesses have started in people's back bedroom, in their garage.
A lot. There's been a lot.
How are they? Yeah, but now we need to figure out how are they financing those, because we're not really seeing the credit movement to finance those. So was this that there was just cash in the bank or other ways to do it? What are we doing policy-wise to make it so a new economy of micro entrepreneurs, where it's you, your spouse, maybe your next door neighbor, have started a business in your garage? How do we make sure they have access to markets and also have access to fair capital? Because that's sort of revolutionary. That's actually really healthy in an economic system. Then what's happening in sort of that smaller mid-level business as they have great difficulty finding labor? What automation, what new designs of their businesses is happening so they can operate without that labor? And how much of the labor shortage is a combination of you've financed folks to have cash at home so they didn't have to work or they had alternatives? And how much of it was already sort of a set demographic trend that even when we go back to normality, we're going to have to deal with the fact we're getting older very fast as a society?
Oh, I think it's a great way to frame it. The other day I interviewed the CEO of Miso Robotics, and Miso Robotics makes a robot called the Flippy. The Flippy works in hamburger joints, and they basically flip buffalo wings and French fries, the hot oil stuff. And in there, but they're growing like crazy right now because of the labor shortage in this industry. You just made me smile when you were talking about this. But let me ask you another question about the kind of broad macro dimension. So I've seen you tweeting, Congressman, about global supply chain. We also know there's a whole heck of tension out there in the U.S.-China economic relationship, even though we're joined at the hip with huge amounts of trade and economic exchange. And I just had somebody on from Alibaba the other day. We were talking to some small businesses, with Alibaba coming in like the Amazon and basically selling their product in China. And I'm just wondering where all of this is going, because if you think about a genuine decoupling of China and the U.S., it's going to have staggering economic consequences. There's a lot of growing consumers, in Asia. And I'm just wondering where you're at, because I know you're interested in trade. Talked to Catherine Tai recently, the U.S. Trade Representative. What is your sense of how America gets smarter about its economic interests, but it doesn't divorce itself from buyers abroad?
Okay, first, one quick side on trade, and she's been wonderful to work with. I'm one of the leaders on trying to change some of the rules at WTO, particularly, when you're having conflict, a conflict on technology, you don't take 10 years to arbitrate it, because by then the technology you're fighting over is gone. This is actually one of the sins that's happening right now in Congress, where we're getting the policies wrong. We're not building policies saying, develop the manufacturing robustness in the United States, or particularly in North America, if you want to use the USMCA. In many ways, the tax policy, it's even in the Build Back Better, is going to slow down capital investments in the United States. So you're not touching the expensing, but if you're doing functionally a corporate minimum tax, alternative minimum tax, you basically take the value away from buying capital production goods and being able to take that depreciation. So just little policies like that change our ability to manufacture, to be a hub of production. So you continue to see the numbers of the trade deficit, and I'm not sure we're engaging in policies that are going to change that. So you lay it all together. The disincentives to enter the labor market, if you're someone with low skill and yet you have corporate America who's now willing to train you. They're so desperate to have labor enter the workforce. And that's a really positive thing. if you incentivize folks saying, hey, we're going to help you, we're going to help you with certain benefits, but we're also going to incentivize you to do the job training into the labor market. We're also going to get the tax code right so it incentivizes investing in capital goods and equipment so we can also continue to become a much bigger hub of manufacturing. Because it's not enough to have sort of a concern on China-U.S. trade and then do all the things that make it so you're not incentivized to build that manufacturing robustness in your own country.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. And then a piece of that, I actually don't know whether the focus on, capital formation and investment was part of the bill, but a really interesting bill passed the Senate in a bipartisan way called the Endless Frontier Act. Senator Coons was one of the leaders on it, but there was a lot of bipartisan support, and it was designed to look at, how do you create the incentives to reinvest in the country, reinvest in technology, invest in science, and that was going to be the response to China, not bashing China, but rather reinvesting in the intellectual and technological muscle in this country and get a lot of it to stick in this country, as you're just talking about. But my understanding is it's languishing in the House. Do you have any insights into what's going on in that?
And there's another version of that I think is also moving in the Senate too. Can I give you sort of and this may be more of a libertarian economist view.
Yeah, please.
You always worry, particularly if some of the incentives are done in a grant format, saying we're going to do these grants so we can get to the next nanometer technology in chip production or quantum. I have a fascination with quantum computing and what we can do there.
Right.
And the federal government often can do amazing things at primary research. The fundamental understanding of the research, and at that point, letting the market just go wild and move its capital around to where it thinks it can promote the breakthrough. Our fear for some of us is what happens when you have a board or committee at the federal level saying, here's what we're willing to invest in. Here's where we're going to give the grant to. Because innovation disruption by committee doesn't work. Often disruption comes from the folks with the crazy idea that can demonstrate to the capital markets, hey, I may have something here that's a home run. So you want to create the disruption, but you may be better off doing it through tax policy, through intellectual protections, and not necessarily resource management from the federal government.
I always love my conversations with you. Representative Dave Schweikert, always learn something. And I want to tell our audience, not only are you a member of the powerful House Ways and Means Committee, a member of the Joint Economic Committee, but what I'm really interested in, and we'll have to talk to you about another day, is you're co-founder of the Blockchain Caucus. I'm very interested in cryptocurrencies and blockchain, so I hope you'll come back and educate me on that front. And it's really, really great to see you. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today.
Thank you for having me.
Great. My next guest is Congresswoman Kwesi Mfume from Maryland. My apologies, Congressman, we just got a little lost here. From Maryland. He's the Vice Chair of the House Committee on Small Business. Congressman, it's great to see you again. Thank you very much. I know you've been working on the agenda of how you get small businesses back in shape again, how we begin dealing with some of the inequities that have been built in this sector. And I've just sort of looked at, can we use a crisis to basically rewire opportunity and fairness and justice inside our economy, because there have been such incredible divergences of outcomes for different communities. And we just wonder how you see it. I think you're muted, Congressman.
Some people prefer me muted, Steve, so.
I don't.
I think the possibility is there, and I think there's been an adjustment that many of us had nothing to do with. It all came about as a result of the pandemic and small businesses having to find creative ways to be able to survive and creative ways to make sure that they, in fact, could bounce back. We're in a situation now, unfortunately, where inflation is starting to overlap some of that for those small businesses. Unlike corporations who've got great reserves and oftentimes can weather a larger storm. Small businesses cannot. And so the supply chain issues affect them disproportionately. The matter of inflation, where we all know where demand outstrips supply, is affecting them. And some have adjusted. The tragedy in all of this is that a lot were lost and will never come back again, but perhaps we've got now a blueprint for the future to insulate small businesses in a different kind of way. There have been a number of ideas that have come out of the Small Business Administration, many, quite frankly, from small businesses themselves, that are being slowly implemented around the country. But the philosophy here is that if we don't find a way to do what we have to do, we're facing something that could be worse than this, what I consider to be a temporary wave of inflation, temporary meaning that it will probably go through the first quarter of next year. And it could be worse also than many of the closings that we've seen, where a lot of businesses will never reopen. So I hope I've kind of answered your question.
It's a good answer, but you've raised something that I think is on a lot of people's minds right now, which is, as you see this uptick, but you've also got pending legislation that has a lot more money. I mean, I try to keep my powder dry and talk to all sides of the equation, but I did have Senator Joe Manchin on here recently, and he said, look, if you take the entire cost of World War II and the Marshall Plan, and you add it up and you put in the dollars, it's less than all these bills that have been passed lately. And so, it raises these interesting questions. Now, there's a lot bigger population in America today. There are other differentiating factors, just to be fair in that. But I think it raises the question that, given what we've seen just happen with the CPI, what do you think the chances are the impact is on Build Back Better as a piece of legislation and the spending attached to it?
Well, I hope Joe was computing that in real dollars. I mean, what happened in 1942 and what's happening now is catastrophic, but the dollars have to be adjusted equally. I think that more than anything else, what we have to keep in mind is where we are. What was our need coming out of all this? What did we have to do at the time to get us to where we are? And so we passed the Cures Act, we passed HEROES Act. We dealt with the rescue plan here that a lot of states and cities are still benefiting from, then the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and now Build Back America. I think, this is just my opinion, of course, that they were all necessary, because in a storm, you want the closest ship, and any ship will do. It's not so much like the recession beforehand, where we had a little bit of time to kind of figure things out. We were impacted absolutely and totally as an economy as a result of the pandemic. Now, whether or not Build Back Better is going to add to that, take away from it, destroy it, or harm it, there are a couple of schools of thought. As you know, several of my colleagues here who have considered themselves to be a little more fiscally responsible, that's their conclusion, decided that they were going to withhold their vote until they got CBO estimates on the entire package, which is their right. And so we did not vote 10 days ago. It looks like we may vote tonight on this, tomorrow at the latest. And if everything falls apart, then we'll be here over the weekend. But the vote is going to come. The CBO estimates will be with us probably around 4 or 5 o'clock today, maybe a little later. And again, those are estimates. That scoring is not an exact prediction of what's going to happen in terms of spending or anything else. But we live and die by CBO scores, so we accept them on both sides of the aisle as an indicator of whether or not we're doing the right thing. That's going to be very telling a little later today, because the larger issue here is passage. And, the Democratic majority is so slim that losing those 5 or 6 votes, should they decide not to vote for it if they got a CBO score they didn't like, really signals, I think, a little bit of doom and gloom for us who think that by passing this, we will again put money into the economy. That money will go into hands of consumers. They will purchase goods and services. There will be a circular flow of income. That circular flow of income eventually will lift all boats. It will pay for itself and certainly not create any sort of deficit spending like some people argue. But the proof is in the pudding, as you know, Steve, and we go through this back and forth as a legislative body and as a country quite a bit. But in this instance, my argument is that this was unlike anything we'd ever seen before. And even if we add up all 3 or 4 or 5 packages, and it's not as much as the Second World War and the Marshall Plan, it was what was needed at the time.
Kwesi, I'm going to ask you a question that's not with you just as a representative, but recognizing the role you played in the NAACP, that you have it in your whole life. I sort of feel like we've come through this period of time after the George Floyd murder, during the pandemic, looking at the economic shocks, how people in this country were able to see in vivid color the divides in opportunity and the divides in terms of the disproportionate impact on people's lives from COVID, economic shocks, et cetera. And I've just been saying to myself, when are we going to act on some of what we saw, which was the horrors of that time, and begin to rewire ourselves, our country, opportunity in different ways? Or are we going to conveniently get amnesia about some of this and go back to a kind of normal that's not normal, if you know what I mean? And I'm just wondering, as you kind of look at civic justice, equality, equity, across gender, are we missing an opportunity to rewire ourselves in a better way?
That's a very good question. We've come a long way since the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and there have been great accomplishments across the spectrum in so many different areas, and a great deal of advancement in terms of equality, social rights, and human rights. But the question really is not having come a long, long way. The question becomes, we've got a long, long way to go, and how do we get there? And more importantly, what path do we take? There's so many sensitivities here that oftentimes when you take one step toward progress, there's a force that's pulling you back the other way. I think where good men and good women of good hearts are honest enough to look at the situation, particularly what's been happening over the last couple of years, and to acknowledge the fact that there are inequities in our society, that there are systemic things that keep us from growing the way we should, and that the issue of race and skin color really ought to be something that's dealt with and embraced, and we can't run away from it. I mean, the nation in many respects was founded on the concept of race. When that happens, there will be progress. When it doesn't happen, there will be finger pointing. And I'm against finger pointing on either side. I don't think that gets us anywhere at all. We've got to come up with solutions. They have to be economic. They have to be educational. They have to be social. They have to be systemic. They have to be institutional in order to create a more perfect union. When you look at just the indicator of unemployment, unemployment in Black and Latino communities is always twice whatever the national average is. And so if we're averaging around 4.8% now, it's 8+% in those communities, particularly among males in those communities under the age of 25. So I believe that in order to address some of the inequities, you've got to find a way to create opportunities, not to give anybody anything, but a chance. And some of that chance means educational opportunities. It means apprenticeships. It means opportunities to be able to live and own homes in communities that are not redlined, where insurance companies are not making decisions based on our zip code or our surname. It means having the sort of medical care and access to medicine that tamps down the large disparity in life expectancy and the other things that we grapple with. And we've got to, I think, measure that periodically. We can't stop now and say, let's 5 years from now, let's see what we've made progress. I think we've always got to be looking, and we've also got to be listening, because there are other people who will make the counter argument, well, that everything is fine, and this is America, and there are no barriers anymore. Those arguments just can't be scoffed at. They have to be dismantled structurally and in terms of facts. And when we do that, we ought to do it in such a way that it becomes a teaching moment for all of us in the country. And I said earlier that I believe in listening also, because the only way you're going to find out, in my opinion, the things that are working against what you believe ought to be the level of progress is to listen to the other side. Sometimes that is ginned up in a way that makes it hard to listen to, like this whole argument that somehow or another schools are teaching kids all these terrible things about history, and you make it an argument over school choice or parental rights. That's not really listening and participating. That's finding a way, I think, to block the issue and to confuse the discussion. But when we open up and sit down across from one another and try to find a way to move ourselves forward, that's the only real way we've done it. It doesn't always happen in the Congress or the State House or the White House. It oftentimes happens in communities where people just happen to find each other to be a little different than they first thought, because once you talk with someone, you get a chance to see that we're all basically the same. Most of us are average. We've got a few geniuses among us and a liberal sprinkling of fools. And when we get past that kind of admission, it's easier then to find the things that we are united with. We all want a better life for our children than the one we had. We all want to believe that we can find a way to deal with crime and have safe communities. We always want to believe that there is hope, opportunity, and the sort of things that internally cause people to inspire themselves to want to do more.
Gosh, I love what you just said, and I just want to underscore it to our audience that in Washington, D.C. in particular, there are a lot of people that are just constantly broadcasting, not a lot of folks that are putting as much time and effort into listening to one another. Really appreciate that framing. We are taking questions from the audience. We have I think a thoughtful question from David Reed, who's owner of Reed Professional Services. And he asks, how can small business owners help with the nation's economic recovery? Not only what help is available to these businesses, what can they do for us? Congressman.
What can small businesses do for us as a nation?
For the economic recovery, I think, rather than thinking about the government giving bailouts to small business, what can small business do to help with the nation's economic recovery?
Well, I think that small businesses have to be efficient and effective in terms of their good or their service. And it's not to say that any are not, but the ones who have not been, unfortunately, no longer exist as a result of the sledgehammer that we continue to call the pandemic. So efficiency it helps. And it helps also to understand the market and to market changes and to be able to address them. I would wish that all small businesses would incrementally grow from quarter to quarter. That doesn't always happen. But where it does happen, it's usually those businesses that are looking past today and looking at what tomorrow might look like in terms of consumer choice, consumer options, what their own base of consumers want and need, and trying to find a way also to push the federal government to remove barriers. I remember years ago, just trying to get a Prompt Payment Act through the Congress was almost revolutionary. And yet, if you were a small business and you had to go from quarter to quarter before receiving money from the government, which you had a contract with, obviously it hampered your ability to make payroll. So what we find on the Small Business Committee is that the best ideas come from the bottom up, not from the top down. And so when business owners come before that committee, they come with ideas and suggestions. And it's been the practice of the committee to listen, whether Democratic or Republican, and to try to find a way to help, because the failure or the demise of small businesses affects all of us in our community. So I just think that small businesses, when they are effective and efficient, when they are working with the government to remove barriers and create opportunities, when they are with their finger in the air testing the winds of change and preparing for those change, I think that helps us, but I know it helps them as well.
Well, Congressman Kwesi Mfume, I really, really appreciate your candor. Look forward to hopefully seeing up in the halls of Congress. We're going to be watching the votes that you're going to be making that are very relevant to the economy tonight and tomorrow. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Steve, thank you. And as a disclaimer, let me just say that none of us have all the answers here. We're all trying to search and find a way to do things better. And I just welcome suggestions and criticisms and input and direction from people who earnestly feel that they've got an idea that ought to be acted on.
Thank you so much, sir. It's really great having you on. Look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate it.
And now for a message from our sponsor, Wells Fargo. Please welcome Bill Daley, Vice Chairman of Public Affairs for Wells Fargo, our former Secretary of Commerce as well. He's in conversation with Brian Agret, President and CEO of City First Bank. Bill, over to you.
Thanks very much, Steve, for that kind introduction. So why don't we kind of get right into this? Brian, first of all, I want to congratulate you on the merger of City First and Broadway and all the opportunities that presents to you now as the largest Black MDI in America. And it's a great opportunity for your customers and for your shareholders. So we really wish you well. A lot of capital has come into minority deposit institutions over the last 10 months or so. Why don't you give us some insight into how you view using that, obviously, again, as the largest MDI in the African-American community nationally?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me. And I also want to thank you, Bill, and Wells for really what's been a longstanding partnership with City First that's continued and increased with the topics we're talking about today. So first and foremost, the merger itself was a significant increase in capacity and scale for our communities by putting these two institutions together. And job one is getting it right, getting the foundation laid, which includes investment in IT and human capital and customer-facing opportunities. And then, as you mentioned, we also, like many in the space, closed the merger concurrent with the capital raise. So to your question, what are you doing as it relates not just to standing up the infrastructure and the capacity, but also really investing that capital? And so we're really focused at City First, and always have been, on ways in which we are closing the racial and the economic, the racial wealth gap and the economic gap for minority communities. And we focus as a commercial lender really on three key areas. The first being focused on the affordable housing segment, where we are particularly interested in minority entrepreneurs and developers to be for-profit or nonprofit, again, hitting the wealth plus the housing segment. Secondly, focused on nonprofit finance. We do a lot of work with nonprofits that are supporting low and moderate income communities and minority communities. And then the last one, and perhaps the one you might be most interested in, really, we also focus significantly on small business finance, where our interest is in minority entrepreneurs and low and moderate income communities, where really wealth, along with small business and housing, clearly being the two areas where we see wealth created, and thus the ability to close the wealth gap. So just thinking about this a little bit from Wells Fargo's perspective, particularly with what I'll call the increased awareness and awakening that we've seen over the last year, and the urgency that's come with that, how is Wells thinking about and addressing the same issue, the racial wealth gap?
Look, there's no doubt that, as you know, because of not only the business you've run, but the fact that we've seen in America, as you mentioned, the awakening around this divide. And the pandemic, let's be honest, has really highlighted the challenges in the African-American, Hispanic community, communities of color, and the disparity, not only with the health crisis, but with the economic crisis. So we've taken a serious look, and starting with our MDI decision, which quite frankly, the decision to invest in MDIs was made before the George Floyd murder and the sort of reaction after that. Because I think there's a real growing sense amongst institutions in the financial service industry, which, let's be honest, the history of the financial service industry, banks specifically, with communities of color, is not anything that people should be proud about historically. But I think there is a realization not only of an opportunity, it's not something about just a charitable thing by any stretch, the opportunity that's there. And if the economic gap can be closed and you can begin to see strengthening in some of these communities that have been challenged, then those of us who are in those communities and trying to help will do better ourselves. So it's to a degree, there's a awareness of a change, but also an opportunity for us. And not only with the MDIs, we've put together an initiative, a 10-year initiative on the unbanked, and trying to find ways with products. So let me come back, Brian, to you. And you laid out in a very eloquent way how the MDIs and what you plan to do with the capital, increased capital that you all have received, you and other MDIs from a series, including us, which we're very proud of. But exactly how do you think, or what changes have to happen in communities as we move forward, and how do we accomplish that together? Big companies, mid-sized companies, small businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. And first, I appreciate the what you laid out about Wells Fargo's approach. And I absolutely believe that CDFIs and MDIs are absolutely part of the solution because it is a distribution system, a trusted, embedded. You have leadership that understands the underlying communities. And so thus, partnerships, as you have suggested and as you are doing strongly with CDFIs and MDIs, really has to be part of the solution. The other part you touched on as well, and that's recognizing that doing the things that the same ways we've done them in the past, either by omission, ignoring, or perhaps not understanding or focusing on these communities and the intermediaries and the products they need, really is not going to work. The problem is too vast and requires really too much collaboration and partnership and capital, quite frankly, for us to solve this. I think what's important to recognize is that CDFIs and MDIs, this is what we do every day. These are the communities we focus on. And so there really is, again, a unique distribution point, intent, focus, discipline, and it can be looked at with the same history of track record that you look at any other business. How well have you served the community, and how well have you grown your business and service? So I think the bottom line here is we all recognize that this has to be done. I always say it's got to be deep and long in partnership and capital with an intent of really knowing that we're not going to solve this tomorrow. But if we're really intent and focused on long-term partnerships, we can begin to chip away and really make a difference, do more than chip away, really make real change. Really, when we think about Wells again and small business, which we talked about earlier, what, given a perspective of a more inclusive recovery, how are you leveraging your small business resources? You mentioned you're the largest of the small business lenders in the country. So I'm very interested in how Wells is looking at that powerful resource.
In addition to being an incredibly important part of our enterprise, what Charlie decided to do, Charlie Sharp, when the PPP program was put together, and out of that, over 80% of the people who are our customers who we helped through that process were small businesses of people of color, headed by people of color, primarily Black, Hispanic. There are also 80+% were 10 employees or less. So these were really small businesses in need. Charlie decided he wanted to take our gross PPP fees, which ended up to be about $420 million, and give those to help support small businesses who were in such need, from everything with trying to save their employees, pay their insurance, keep their doors open, or at least even if they closed them, to pay the bills so they could reopen at a certain point. So we worked with CDFIs to quickly get out over $305 million in the first year. We had another $50 million we took, or $305 million. We took $50 million and worked with not-for-profit organizations to help work with individuals to get them ready as small business leaders to address the issues of financial literacy and some of their financial concerns in advising them. And now we're in the final throes of coming up with a plan to give away the last $100 million, again, to organizations that would work with small businesses. One of the things we've noticed is small businesses right now need assets. They need the small things, whether it's a new pizza oven in the pizza parlor or a new heating facility. So we're in the process of giving away that final $100 million, and it makes us very proud of that. So I know we're running out of time. I want to thank you, Brian. I want to thank you for your leadership, and let's all keep pulling together to make sure that the economic recovery comes throughout this nation and not just in certain parts. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you as well, Bill.
Thank you, Bill Daly and Brian Argrett. Bill, you could take my seat here. You're a really great interviewer. That brings us to the end of our program. A big thank you to Wells Fargo for its support and to all of you attendees for joining us for this discussion. For any of you who missed the conversations, we're going to have the video from the event up on our website shortly. Have a great day. I'm Steve Clements. Be well.